Welcome back to Property Revenge, where we share the most incredible stories of HOA bullies who picked the wrong person to mess with and ended up learning some very expensive lessons. Today's story is absolutely wild. It involves a power-hungry HOA president who tried to use police intimidation to force someone out of their home, only to discover she was tangling with a real estate mogul who played chess while she was playing checkers. Picture this. You're living peacefully in your suburban home when the HOA Karen decides you don't belong in her neighborhood and starts calling the cops on you for imaginary violations. She thinks she's got you cornered with her clipboard full of fake complaints and her connections with local police. But what happens when her harassment campaign backfires so spectacularly that she ends up having to pay you rent every month? Stick around because this revenge story has the most satisfying twist involving foreclosure auctions, shell companies, and a landlord-tenant relationship that will make you believe in karma. Our story takes place in Willowbrook Heights, an upscale suburban community outside Phoenix, Arizona, where perfectly manicured lawns and strict HOA enforcement create an atmosphere of suburban perfection, or suburban tyranny, depending on your perspective. Meet Dr. Marcus Chen, a 41-year-old emergency room physician who had recently moved to Arizona for a new position at Phoenix General Hospital. Marcus was quiet, professional, and preferred to keep to himself after long shifts saving lives. He had purchased a beautiful 3,500 square foot home in Willowbrook Heights as a place to decompress from the stress of emergency medicine. What most neighbors didn't know was that Marcus came from a family of successful real estate investors and had been quietly building his own property portfolio for over 15 years. Then there's Patricia "Pat" Williamson, the 54-year-old HOA president who treated Willowbrook Heights like her personal kingdom. Pat was a former real estate agent who had married well and spent her days micromanaging every aspect of the community. She drove a white BMW X7, carried herself with the entitlement of someone who had never been told no, and believed that her position as HOA president gave her the right to control who belonged in her neighborhood. Supporting this suburban drama was Officer Jake Mitchell, a local police officer who had been manipulated into Pat's harassment scheme, Detective Sarah Rodriguez, whose investigation would uncover the truth, and Judge Helen Martinez, who would ultimately decide Pat's fate in foreclosure court. Dr. Marcus Chen had been living peacefully in Willowbrook Heights for 6 months when Pat Williamson first noticed him. Marcus worked irregular hospital shifts, sometimes coming home at 3 a.m. after particularly difficult nights in the ER. He drove a practical Honda Accord rather than the luxury vehicles most neighbors preferred, and he kept to himself, which Pat interpreted as antisocial behavior. Marcus's house was immaculate. He paid a lawn service to maintain the landscaping, kept his property in perfect condition, and never caused any disturbances. But Pat had already decided that Marcus didn't fit the community image she was trying to maintain. The harassment began subtly. Marcus would receive notices about violations that didn't exist, claims that his grass was too long when it was perfectly maintained, complaints about his car being improperly parked in his own driveway, citations for unauthorized modifications when he had installed nothing but HOA-approved improvements. Marcus tried to address the complaints professionally, attending HOA meetings and requesting specific information about the alleged violations. But Pat would dismiss his concerns with condescending explanations about community standards and the importance of maintaining property values. "Dr. Chen, I'm sure you mean well, but this community has certain expectations," Pat would say with a fake smile. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a less prestigious neighborhood." The implication was clear, and Marcus recognized discrimination when he saw it. But as an emergency room physician, he was used to dealing with difficult people and chose to document everything rather than escalate the conflict. Pat's harassment campaign intensified when Marcus didn't take her hints and move away. She began conducting inspections of his property, taking photos and measurements while he was at work. She would walk around his house with a clipboard, looking for any possible violation she could cite. When Marcus installed a small security system with visible cameras, Pat filed a complaint claiming the cameras were intimidating neighbors and violated privacy regulations. When Marcus planted flowers in his front garden, she claimed he hadn't received proper approval for landscaping modifications. Marcus continued to respond professionally to each complaint, providing documentation that his improvements were either exempt from HOA approval or had been properly submitted and approved. But Pat seemed determined to find something, anything that would give her leverage to force him out. The situation escalated dramatically when Pat decided to weaponize local law enforcement. She began calling the police with complaints about Marcus, claiming he was engaged in suspicious activities and might be dealing drugs from his home. Her first call to 911 claimed she had seen unusual traffic at Marcus's house and suspected drug activity. Officer Jake Mitchell responded to find Marcus arriving home from a 16-hour shift at the hospital, still wearing his scrubs with his hospital ID clearly visible. "Sir, we received a complaint about possible drug activity at this address," Officer Mitchell explained, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Marcus was exhausted but cooperative. "Officer, I'm an emergency room physician at Phoenix General. I just worked a double shift. My neighbor has been harassing me for months with false HOA complaints." Officer Mitchell looked at Marcus's hospital ID and medical license, then at the pristine house and luxury neighborhood. "Sir, I have to follow up on complaints, but this doesn't look like any drug operation I've ever seen." Pat appeared from her house across the street, approaching with her usual authoritative stride. "Officer, thank you for responding. This man has been causing problems in our community for months." "Ma'am, what specific illegal activity have you observed?" Pat launched into a litany of complaints about HOA violations, noise disturbances, and suspicious behavior, but couldn't point to any actual crimes. Officer Mitchell realized he was being used in a neighbor dispute and politely ended the encounter. But Pat wasn't finished. Over the next month, she called the police 6 more times with increasingly ridiculous complaints. She claimed Marcus was running an illegal business from his home. He occasionally worked on hospital paperwork. She reported domestic disturbances when Marcus had friends over for dinner. She even called to report suspicious modifications to his house when he had a plumber fix a leaky faucet. Each police response found no evidence of wrongdoing, and the officers began to recognize Pat's pattern of false complaints. But Marcus was getting fed up with being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. The breaking point came when Pat called 911 claiming Marcus had threatened her during an HOA meeting. The incident never happened. Marcus had been working at the hospital during the supposed confrontation, but Pat's complaint triggered a more serious police response. Detective Sarah Rodriguez was assigned to investigate the alleged threat. When she reviewed the pattern of calls and complaints, she immediately recognized what was happening. "Dr. Chin, I've reviewed all the complaints filed against you, and I see a pattern of harassment rather than legitimate concerns. Have you considered filing charges against Ms. Williamson for false police reports?" Marcus had been thinking the same thing. As someone who worked in emergency medicine, he understood how false 911 calls wasted resources and endangered public safety. But he had also been doing some research of his own. "Detective Rodriguez, I've been documenting everything. But I've also discovered some interesting information about Ms. Williamson's financial situation." Marcus had used his real estate knowledge to research property records and discovered that Pat's financial situation wasn't as stable as her lifestyle suggested. Her house had been refinanced multiple times, she had significant credit card debt, and she was behind on her HOA dues. Ironically, the same dues she was so eager to collect from everyone else. More importantly, Marcus had discovered that Pat's house was about to go into foreclosure. Her husband's business had failed, and they were 3 months behind on mortgage payments. The foreclosure notice had been filed with the county, but Pat was still playing HOA dictator while her own financial world was collapsing. Marcus realized this was an opportunity for both justice and investment. Arizona's foreclosure laws allowed investors to purchase distressed properties at auction, and Pat's house was exactly the type of investment Marcus had been looking for. As a successful physician with a strong credit rating and significant cash reserves, Marcus was in a perfect position to bid on foreclosed properties. He had been building his real estate portfolio for years, but this would be his first foreclosure purchase, and his most personally satisfying investment. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for the following month. Marcus hired a real estate attorney to handle the legal aspects and began researching the property's value and condition. Pat's house was worth approximately $650,000, but the mortgage balance was $480,000, making it an attractive investment opportunity. Meanwhile, Pat continued her harassment campaign, unaware that her target was preparing to become her mortgage holder. She filed more false police reports, sent threatening letters about HOA violations, and even organized a neighborhood safety meeting where she tried to convince other residents that Marcus was a threat to community security. The other homeowners weren't buying Pat's story. Marcus was obviously a respected physician who kept his property immaculate and minded his own business. Pat's obsession with harassing him was making other neighbors uncomfortable, and some began to question her leadership of the HOA. The foreclosure auction took place on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. Pat was at the hospital with her husband, who was having minor surgery, completely unaware that her house was being sold to pay off her debts. Marcus attended the auction with his attorney and a certified check for $500,000. There were only 3 other bidders for Pat's property, and Marcus's opening bid of $485,000 scared off most of the competition. He won the auction with a final bid of $495,000 to $15,000 over the mortgage balance and significantly below market value. The legal paperwork was processed immediately, and Marcus became the legal owner of Pat's house before she even returned from the hospital. Under Arizona law, Pat now had 30 days to vacate the property unless she arranged to rent it from the new owner. Marcus decided to offer Pat a rental agreement at fair market value, $2,800 per month for the house she had owned until that morning. His attorney delivered the eviction notice and rental offer to Pat's house that evening. Pat's reaction was explosive. She called Marcus immediately, screaming about conspiracies and illegal activities, threatening to sue him and have him arrested. Marcus calmly explained that he had purchased her house legally at a foreclosure auction and was offering her the option to remain as a tenant. "This is impossible. You can't just steal someone's house." "Mrs. Williamson, I didn't steal anything. Your mortgage company foreclosed due to non-payment, and I purchased the property at a legal auction. You have 30 days to decide whether you want to rent from me or find alternative housing." Pat hung up and immediately called the police, claiming Marcus had somehow illegally seized her property. When Officer Mitchell arrived to investigate her complaint, he had to explain that foreclosure sales were legal and that Marcus was now the rightful owner of her house. "Ma'am, if you were behind on your mortgage payments, the bank has the legal right to foreclose and sell the property. This gentleman appears to have purchased it legally." Pat couldn't believe her perfect harassment plan had backfired so completely. She hired an attorney to challenge the foreclosure sale, but the paperwork was airtight. Marcus had followed every legal requirement, and Pat's own financial records proved she was in default on her mortgage. Facing the reality of homelessness, Pat swallowed her pride and agreed to rent her former house from Marcus. The rental agreement included strict terms about harassment and required Pat to cease all HOA-related retaliation against Marcus. The irony was delicious. Pat now had to pay Marcus $2,800 every month to live in the house she had owned until her harassment campaign backfired. Every rent check was a reminder that her attempts to force Marcus out of the neighborhood had instead made him her landlord. But the story gets even better. As Pat's landlord, Marcus had legal authority to inspect the property and ensure it was being maintained according to lease terms. He began conducting monthly inspections, documenting any maintenance issues or lease violations with the same meticulous attention to detail that Pat had used in her harassment campaign. Marcus also discovered that as a rental property owner, he was entitled to attend HOA meetings and participate in community governance. He used his new position to push for reforms that would prevent future harassment campaigns and protect residents from discriminatory enforcement. Within 6 months, Marcus had been elected to the HOA board, replacing Pat, who had resigned in shame after her foreclosure became neighborhood gossip. As a board member, Marcus implemented policies requiring documentation of all violations, prohibiting discriminatory enforcement, and establishing appeal processes for disputed citations. Pat's rental payments continued like clockwork. As a physician, Marcus understood the importance of stable housing, and he was a fair landlord who maintained the property professionally. But every month, Pat had to write a check to the man she had tried so hard to drive out of the neighborhood. The legal consequences of Pat's false police reports eventually caught up with her. Detective Rodriguez's investigation resulted in charges for filing false police reports and harassment. Pat received 6 months of probation and was required to attend anger management classes. The criminal conviction also provided grounds for Marcus to include a good behavior clause in Pat's lease renewal, requiring her to maintain civil behavior toward all neighbors and prohibiting any retaliation or harassment. Word of Pat's situation spread throughout the real estate and medical communities, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of harassment and discrimination. Marcus became something of a local legend among physicians and real estate investors who admired his patient, strategic approach to dealing with a bully. Pat's husband, embarrassed by his wife's behavior and its consequences, filed for divorce within a year. Pat had to find a smaller apartment she could afford on her own, finally leaving the house she had tried so hard to defend from Marcus's presence. Marcus eventually sold Pat's former house to a young family for a significant profit, using the proceeds to expand his real estate portfolio. The new owners were an interracial couple with young children who became wonderful neighbors and appreciated Marcus's efforts to make the community more welcoming. The HOA that Pat had once ruled with an iron fist was transformed under new leadership. Marcus helped establish policies that focused on genuine community improvement rather than petty harassment, and Willowbrook Heights became known as one of the more progressive and inclusive communities in the area. Detective Rodriguez used Pat's case as a training example for other officers about recognizing and addressing harassment campaigns disguised as legitimate complaints. She was later promoted to sergeant and specialized in investigating neighbor disputes and harassment cases. Officer Mitchell, who had been unknowingly used in Pat's harassment scheme, became more cautious about neighbor complaint calls and better at identifying patterns of false reports. He received additional training in community policing and conflict resolution. Judge Martinez, who had overseen the foreclosure proceedings, noted that Marcus's case was one of the most legally sound and well-documented foreclosure purchases she had seen. She later invited Marcus to speak to a real estate investment group about the legal aspects of foreclosure auctions. The moral lessons from this incredible Arizona tale resonate on multiple levels. First, harassment campaigns often reveal more about the harasser's vulnerabilities than their target's weaknesses. Pat's obsession with controlling Marcus distracted her from her own financial crisis and ultimately made her situation worse. Second, documentation is crucial when dealing with harassment or discrimination. Marcus's meticulous record-keeping provided the evidence needed to support his case and protect himself from false accusations. Third, sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing natural consequences to play out. Marcus didn't need to plot elaborate schemes against Pat. Her own poor financial decisions and harassment behavior created the perfect opportunity for poetic justice. Fourth, understanding legal systems and market opportunities can turn harassment into investment opportunity. Marcus's knowledge of real estate law and foreclosure procedures allowed him to transform Pat's attacks into a profitable real estate deal. Finally, the story demonstrates that bullies often create the very consequences they fear most. Pat's attempts to force Marcus out of the neighborhood ended up giving him more power and authority in that same neighborhood than he had ever wanted. Today, Marcus continues to practice emergency medicine and manage his growing real estate portfolio. He still owns several properties in Willowbrook Heights and serves on the HOA board, where he's known for fair enforcement and community building initiatives. Pat lives in a modest apartment across town, working part-time and still dealing with the financial consequences of her foreclosure. She occasionally drives past her old neighborhood, probably wondering how her perfect plan to control her community ended up costing her everything. The house where this drama unfolded is now home to a family who appreciates both the beautiful property and the welcoming community that emerged from the ashes of Pat's reign of terror. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply letting a bully's own actions create the consequences they so richly deserve. And every month, for 2 years, Pat had to write a rent check to the man she tried to destroy, a constant reminder that in real estate, as in life, sometimes the person you're trying to push around ends up holding all the cards.